Welcome to Molecules to Market, a program by Portfolio Planning Plus. We are truly honored today to welcome back Mr. Sanjay Gupta as a returning guest, continuing his commendable commitment to sharing his knowledge and passing on his experience to the next generation. For listeners joining us for the first time, let me briefly introduce him. I am bringing up his profile on our platform now. Mr. Sanjay Gupta is the former CEO of Dangote Refinery and Petrochemicals project, and also the former chairman and managing director of Engineers India Limited, EIL. He has been associated with the hydrocarbon industry for over 4.5 decades and has been actively involved in the conceptualization, detailing, and implementation of mega projects with billions of US dollar stake. He is universally acknowledged in the industry as a stalwart in his field. He's seen with respect for his knowledge and authority on the subject. In our inaugural conversation with Mr. Sanjay Gupta, he gave us a brilliant overview of 45 years of development in India's hydrocarbon sector. Today, he will go deeper into the refining industry, first within the Indian context, and then in the broader global context. Mr. Sanjay Gupta, the floor is yours. The floor is yours. We are looking forward to your invaluable insights.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to say hello to you. The subject itself is very intriguing and interesting. And as you might be aware, in the past 5 decades, not much has happened in the refining industry in the West. Yeah, no new refinery obviously has come in US. We haven't seen anything coming up in Europe. On the contrary, we've seen the closure of refineries, both in USA as well as in Europe. On the contrary, in the Asian subcontinent, there has been a lot of activity in the hydrocarbon side, and both China and India, in particular, have been propelling this particular industry in a big way. And today we will have a chance to discuss a little bit about what is happening in India. While on the subject, we will also discuss a little bit about new virgin gas through plant, which has happened elsewhere also, and try and draw some comparisons about the various kinds of configurations that are being followed and the policies which are being adopted to construct these refineries, and have them adapted to the various changes which are taking place in the market. So, this is in continuation of the first session which we had, in which a general perspective about what has happened in the hydrocarbon segment in India was broadly discussed. We'll pick up the link from there and try and see as to what really has happened in the refining segment and how people keep hearing about India emerging as a refining hub, and very soon in future to also look at petrochemicals in a very big way. And today, if we are a refining hub, hopefully in times to come, I think the day is not very far when we will be adding tremendous amount of petrochemical capacity also. So I thought I'll run through some of the interesting developments which have taken place in the country and how this industry is maturing, how technologies have come in, how we have evolved some configurations, and try to see as to how best we can synergize those with the current market requirements. So, as I mentioned yesterday, in the initial stages, particularly in India, the refining segment was a particularly small one, not much refining capacity. The intent was good, but not too much of capacity was established in the country. It was only in the early 90s when the country began to open up to reforms and the market economy had set in and the private sector was allowed to participate to construct or get involved in refinery installations also, that actually the real momentum was given to this particular segment. There are a whole lot of refineries started cropping up that point of time. And one important development which happened was that while Reliance set up the scale, because they changed the dynamics of project building in the country, both in terms of scale, complexity, and maturity. Similarly, the hydrocarbon segment, which was predominantly in the PSU segment till the early 90s, with the reform also began to see a lot of merit in looking into installations of scale. Therefore, a number of refineries started being conceptualized to cater to the market requirements. Now, incidentally, at that point of time, uh, in India, the kind of requirements which we had were predominantly driven by what is required as a fuel for cooking. That is one major objective function. And other part was that the country was predominantly having a diesel based requirement. The gasoline requirement was there, but to a large extent, we still felt that the gasoline requirement in the country was not too high. We were still, all our railways, installations, and major other factories were consuming a lot of diesel. So most of the configurations which had to be set up was with the predominance of diesel and also with LPG in mind. Even in those days, we had the requirement of kerosene as a cooking fuel. So, since early 90s to maybe early 2000 or so, we also had kerosene as an important fuel, which was rationed and distributed across to a large mass of people in the country to be utilized as cooking fuel. So, our refineries strangely had a requirement of LPG maximization, diesel maximization, and 7 to 8% of the throughput as kerosene. That is how most of our refineries were conceived. The other important part was that since we had struck some oil in the country, it was sweet crude. So most of the Mumbai high region was producing sweet crude. So that became one of the bases that most of the refineries which were being configured were with sweet crude as one objective function and sour crude as another. So the other part was to source a lot of crude from the Middle East, which was obviously in the immediate vicinity of the country. So most of the refineries, when they began to be configured, they were designed either on a 50-50 basis, sweet sour, or on the basis of 30-70, so that we could have a predominance of sour crude. That built in a lot of flexibility and a lot of complications, or let's say the Nelson complexity was to improve gradually. But when we first started with the real refineries to scale up, the bottoms was still an issue which was being investigated. At that point of time, the country did have a lot of requirement of bitumen and significant requirement of fuel oil. So the bottoms configuration to that extent chose for itself, and we didn't have a very high conversion capacity to support the bottoms. So largely most of the refineries which were being conceived had a predominant CCR block, that is the gasoline block, to optimize the gasoline requirements. And on the secondary processing side, we could either have a combination of hydrocracking and FCC as one configuration, or we could have a predominance of hydrocracking. So I'll just give you a reference of some refineries which started on these configurations to address the market requirements and how they evolved gradually to look the way they look today, which is vastly different from the way that they were conceived earlier on. So most of these refineries, when they were started, we scaled up from 3 million tons to mostly 6 million tons. So in the period of 90s, we were looking at refineries in the PSU segment to address a capacity of 6 million tons as throughput. So typically, most of the refineries had a crude distillation unit and a vacuum distillation unit, and the VGO from the vacuum distillation unit either found way into hydrocracker to maximize the diesel produce, or in some cases we had a combination of hydrocracker plus FCC. And the FCCs, when they first came up at this point of time, they were designed on the resid route, so that partly the bottoms which we were getting from there, instead of having a conversion unit, some part of the residue was upgraded in this RFCC. So the configurations were that the bottoms of the hydrocracker and a part of the vacuum residue was put together to go into an RFCC unit. So we had a combination of a hydrocracker and RFCC sitting in the middle or as a secondary processing block to yield or to maximize a diesel, LPG, and gasoline produce. Most of the straight run material, that means the straight run LPG, naphtha, naphtha was split into two major components, the lighter naphtha and the heavier naphtha. Now, in India, unfortunately, since we didn't have gas, most of the lighter naphtha from our crude distillation units were actually utilized to support the hydrogen blocks. So we had a lot of hydrogen plant capacity which was required to support the hydrocracking and the subsequent hydro treatments which were to follow. So most of the light naphtha was utilized there. The heavy naphtha was routed to the CCRs. Most of the refineries typically had this configuration because there was paucity of gas in the country, and a refinery was not finding favor to be integrated for gas availability from the external end at this point of time, because there were other priorities to be addressed. Preferentially, the gas used to go in the fertilizer segment, power generation, a part of it in the steel segment, and later on it emerged to go into the pipe for piped gas to be integrated in for the household cooking purposes. So that is how most of the configurations initially developed. And the bottoms, most of the refineries were equipped with a bitumen unit because we had considerable requirement of bitumen, which was a seasonal product, and a lot of fuel oil was produced through a visbreaker unit. So there were many refineries in India which were supporting visbreaker units. Uh, now, at that point of time, in the 90s or so, the specifications which associated with the products which we were producing were not very stringent. We were in the Euro 2 and Euro 3 regime, so to say. So most of the hydro treatment in the plant, in the configuration of the refineries, was not very high. Even if something was put up in the refineries, it was predominantly a DHDS unit to control, let's say, the sulfur levels to maybe about 50 or maybe 250 to 500 ppm, depending upon various configurations. And the C10 numbers were floating around 48 or so. So you were far.
Can you please explain what DHDS you have just mentioned stands for?
Yeah. So the straight run diesel and some visbreaker gas oils which were being produced, they needed to be upgraded in the refinery so that the diesel could meet the product quality. So even if we were to meet Euro 3 specification, the net sulfur in the diesel was actually an issue. So that is why we put some diesel hydrodesulphurization units. The intent of that unit was not to crack the diesel or upgrade the CETAN number, but was primarily to reduce the sulfur level in the product stream to meet the Euro 3 specifications. In the process, the cetane increment was incidental. So we were addressing a pool cetane of roughly around 48 at that point of time. This is what I meant by that. Now, in the later part of the refineries, as they grew, something else happened here. That is why I wanted to mention this part. So, some of the early configurations were around 6 million ton, typically equipped with a hydrocracker with the bottoms routed to an RFCC. which also took a little bit of residue. So this was one configuration which was very popular. The bottoms produced a lot of fuel oil, but it was all to Euro 3 specifications with sulfur levels upwards of 1% or so. And a lot of bitumen was produced to meet the infrastructure road requirements.
To give the listeners an idea about the scale we are talking about, so you speak in million tons, 6 million tons. Can we convert this into
Yeah.
barrels?
So about 120,000 barrels a day. 6 million ton is roughly about 120,000 barrels per day. So it was still
Okay.
very small by normal standards, but this was an upgrade from maybe a 3 million ton, which was probably a common capacity at that point of time. So from 3, we scaled up to 6 in the period of 90s or so. The number of refineries came up with about 6 million ton capacity, and then they were kept expanding. So in the first refinery, when we started with 6, then we expanded this refinery to add another 9 million tons. Now, at that time, the objective function of the refineries began to change. So, I'm mentioning one refinery which went from 6 to 15 million tons. And in that particular process, we had another crude and vacuum distillation unit. And in the since I still mentioned, our main requirement was to address the requirement of, let's say, LPG and diesel, and gasoline was more or less saturated to about 20 to 25% of the produce. So when we went for 9 million tons in most of these refineries, the VGO was upgraded in a full conversion hydrocracker because the diesel requirement was predominantly high. So the FCC was dropped and you had only the full conversion hydrocracker. But in the bottom, something interesting happened. We now wanted more conversion in the refinery. So the fuel oil or the vacuum residue from the existing refinery of 6 million tons and the new refinery of 9 million tons, the entire vacuum residue was upgraded in a coker unit. So there was a flurry of cokers in most of the Indian refineries. So lots of coker capacity was built at that point of time. So all
Can you
the coker,
maybe explain what is the benefit of doing bottom of the barrel conversion in a coker unit instead of going through the FCC with the vacuum residue and the bottom fraction from the hydrocracker?
yeah, yeah. Actually, the sole idea was that hydrocracker and FCC actually sits on the VGO cut. So when I put a vacuum column, I get three cuts from there. There is a vac diesel which comes from there that is combined with the diesel which is coming from the atmospheric column. So it goes into the straight run diesel pool. The VGO from there, this is a 370 C cut plus material. Now cannot be pulled into the diesel. It has to be upgraded in a conversion facility. So either it has to go to an FCC or it has to go to a hydrocracker. Now, at that point of time, since the country's objective function was to maximize diesel, that's what I mentioned. This VGO, as a secondary processing for the secondary processing units, from the vacuum column, found way into the hydrocracker, and this was a full conversion hydrocracker, 92% conversion. So everything was which was being put into the hydrocracker was predominantly being converted into diesel as such. The other important part was at this point of time, our requirements for kerosene was also getting saturated. So the kerosene cut, which was a fuel requirement at a certain point of time, was being phased out. So all the kerosene from the refinery was also pushed in the full conversion hydrocracker to be upgraded as diesel. Again, the idea was to maximize the diesel, right? But the bottoms of the vacuum column, which is the vacuum residue from the 9 million ton expansion as well as the original 6 million ton refinery, which was going to visbreaker and bitumen, that entire residue plus new residue is now available as a feedstock for higher conversion. This formed the feedstock to the cokers. So all the vacuum residue from the existing refinery and new refinery was pushed into the coker. The idea behind coker was that it gives me about 70% conversion. So all the vacuum residue which goes into the coker, 70% of that is recovered as distillate, that is LPG, naphtha, and diesel. And what you get in the bottoms is coke. So 30% odd roughly, which is the coke, that was an horizontal integration to either the utility power plants or it was sent to some cement kilns. But the 70% conversion of material from here, which was converted into value added products, was now available to go into the refinery product pool. That is how the conversion of the refineries improved, the complexity of the refineries improved. So all the diesel cut from here was now upgraded into a DHDT unit. So all the DHDS plants of the existing refinery, which was producing diesel up to 48, the entire diesel of 48 cetane was brought into DHDT unit. All coker diesel was put into this unit as well, along with the additional straight run diesel which came from the new atmospheric distillation unit, and this was upgraded in a high severity DHDT unit. Now, this unit was intended with the purpose of incremental cetane to roughly 4 to 6 numbers, with the target of pool cetane to be addressed as 51. That means the entire diesel which was produced in the refinery, both in the existing refinery as well as the new refinery, was now addressing a cetane number of 51. That means we were heading towards Euro 6, Euro 4, Euro 6. Product quality was improving. Sulfur levels were coming down. We were either hitting 50 ppm or even lesser. Those refineries which were equipped with hydrocrackers, we were actually even able to bring it down to 10 ppm also. So the quality of diesel improved dramatically, and all the else HCGO which came from the coker, which is also a material like VGO, but it has a higher sulfur content, a more asphaltene content, that was pushed into the hydrocrackers for upgradation. So the hydrocrackers complexity also was very high, but the conversion levels all increased to dramatically improve the total diesel content of the refineries. So, in the overall product patterns, we had more LPG, more diesel, gasoline around 20 to 25% mostly. We did have a lot of coke, and since we are processing a lot of sour crude, we also had a lot of sulfur which was produced in the refinery. So, these were auxiliary products. But most of the refinery configurations began to look like this. So there were many refineries where you had maybe two hydrocrackers supporting full conversion. You had some refineries with a hydrocracker and an RFCC. Uh, but almost all the refineries began to look at coker closely because the capex of the coker unit was relatively low, and the conversion of 70% was good as long as we were able to find an outlet for coke. So that is why most of the refineries in India at that point of time looked at cokers very, very closely. So I think almost all the refineries in India have a coker equipped with them, unless of course the recent times where something else is happening.
So I mean, it's maybe not only the capex of the coker that is more advantageous, but also if you go to an FCC, there is a catalyst factor, as a catalyst is a consumable, and it adds a significant cost to the conversion process.
Yeah. See, the problem with an FCC or routing the resid to an RFCC is that beyond a certain point, the coke make in the RFCC becomes an issue. So one can only put a controlled number, controlled residue into an RFCC. Otherwise, you will have to hydrotreat the feedstock. Now, that is the third part of generational change which took place in the FCCs. where something else happened. I'm going to tell you a little while about that as to what really happened in those refineries and how it got changed. But at that till that point of time, some analysis revealed that 17 to 20% was a good number of residue which could be pushed into an FCC along with the hydrocracker bottoms. Anything more than that upset the equilibrium of the FCC, and then of course there was need to put catalyst coolers and things like that to control the reaction within the regenerator. So the FCCs will become more complex with more coke make. So this profitability analysis and the complication around the FCC is also an important phenomenon. Whereas converting residue directly into a coker was found as a very optimal solution in India. So everywhere, because we had a utilization of coke at that point of time, so coke was being picked up as a product, and 70% conversion of residue was very good. So we had a lot of coking capacity established in the country: 3 million, 2.4 million, 4.4 million. In fact, Reliance has as many as 8 coke chambers. I think they are upwards of 8 million. So coker was a very preferred configuration in India till a certain point of time. So, because it upgrades extremely well, gives you the right kind of products, and at a relatively low cost. So, all our screening studies were actually leading to this configuration. This was still maybe about 2005 or so that most of the configurations look like this. But then there was an objective function change. Most of the refineries began to look with the intent of horizontal integration to petrochemicals. So there are two major developments which took place in India at that point of time. One was that we were beginning to look at both aromatics and olefins to be integrated with the complexes. So there were several refineries in India where initially we found that uh, setting up an aromatic complex with a PX-PTA was one configuration which became popular. So let's say for in a typical refinery, we found that a lot of heavy naphtha which was being produced in the refinery, we had only a limited requirement of gasoline. So a lot of heavy naphtha was available, number one. Number two, since refineries are all well spread out in the country and the owners are common, so the owner also had the option of picking up the naphtha cuts from various refineries and transporting that naphtha centrally to a place where it could be upgraded into aromatics. So in one refinery, we had all the naphtha, heavy naphtha being put together in one place. We had a xylene complex, and from the xylene complex, it was close coupled to a PTA unit. So that was one chain which began to become popular. So that was one set of the configuration which happened as part of a horizontal addition to a complex. The other part was that because we had a lot of light naphtha in the plant, which was predominantly being used for the hydrogen plants, somewhere around mid to 2005 onwards, some gas was getting available for the refineries also. Once that happened, once the gas integration took place, there was a possibility of displacing light naphtha, which was being used for production of hydrogen. So a lot of naphtha got surplus from there. So we had this naphtha, which is lighter naphtha, less than 90 degrees centigrade material, cut material, and we also had naphtha, which was available as surplus from the other refineries. So this naphtha was all collected together, and in the same complex, an olefin plant was also added. So gradually the plants became more and more complex. What started with, let's say, a 6 million ton refinery became a 15 million ton refinery, added for itself with horizontal integration with other refineries, an aromatic block with a PTA, and further added an olefin complex of maybe up to 1 million tons capacity. to produce a lot of ethylene, propylene, which was converted into polymers. So most of the refineries and the configuration in India began to have petrochemical integration. This was one type of integration which happened in the refineries. Some refineries which were predominantly hydrocracker driven, so they produced a lot of diesel in the plant, but they were processing the kind of crude, let's say a lot of Iranian crude was being processed at that point of time, which was also highly aromatic rich. So those refineries utilized the possibility of utilizing all that naphtha to set up a massive xylene complex. And those capacities are very large. So they set up a xylene complex to utilize that, but they did not have a chance and the opportunity to integrate with other refineries. So they missed they possibly could not put up an olefin complex, but they had large aromatic complexes, which where the xylene was now available for other refiners to pick up as a product to convert into PTA. So this was the second level of change which happened in several refineries in India. But around this time, between 2007 to let's say 15, the configuration objective functions began to change. Every refinery began to address the requirement of diesel and petrochemicals very, very carefully. This was the time where there was a very considered attempt made to even rationalize the diesel consumption in the country. So a lot of electrification emphasis was given to railways and the other sectors. So there was a chance to see the diesel demand was still high, but the option of looking into other opportunities was also over there. So most of the refineries began to look at a different objective function. They began to look at rationalized diesel, still high LPG requirement, but they began to look at petrochemicals very, very carefully. So the sole idea was, can we look into an FCC configuration which could be high severity? And that is when most of the configurations completely altered. Hydrocrackers actually practically went out. So most of the configurations began to look like this. You had a crude distillation unit, you had a vacuum distillation unit, and the VGO from there was processed in a VGO hydrotreater. The idea was to keep it at low severity, convert 80 to 85% of material as hydrotreated feedstock with a low CCR number, and convert the whole of this feedstock through a petro FCC or a high severity FCC with very high conversion. The intention in these plants was to address a propylene make of upwards of 20%. So all the cracking in the FCC, uh, instead of conventional 540 to 545 degrees, went up to 565 degrees plus. The intention was to produce as much propylene as is possible. The gasoline was rationalized. The diesel was reduced. So diesel and gasoline in a way was cracked in the FCC to push much higher LPG and propylene make. So we had a lot of crack.
So when you mention these stages from resid FCC, RFCC to cooking refinery to high severity FCC, were these stages in the life of the refineries, different phases or revamp? Um, I mean, the cookers were maintained, and you had an additional conversion refinery with the high severity FCC, or did the new installation units replace the previous one?
We had a combination of the two. We had a lot of new and virgin grassroots refineries. We began to look at this configuration, which I just mentioned: a crude distillation unit, a vacuum distillation unit, VGO being fed to VGO hydrotreater, from there going to a high severity FCCs with a coker sitting at the bottom. On the vacuum residue, we had a coker. So all the diesel from the coker still found way into a DHDT. So there was another unit, a coker and a diesel hydrotreater, which processed all the diesel which is straight run, diesel coming from the coker to upgrade it to 51 C10 to meet the market requirements. The HCGO which came from the coker went to the VGO hydrotreater to increase the feedstock of FCC. So the petro FCCs became bigger, 2.4 to 2.6 million tons, most of them, on a high severity route. So each of the FCC was producing close to 500 KT of propylene. Very significant amount of propylene was being processed. So immediately that got close coupled to a polypropylene unit. So most of the refineries began to look like this: CDU, VDU, VGO hydrotreater, high severity FCC coupled to a polypropylene unit. And on the bottom section, we had a coker, a diesel hydrotreater, and the HCGO going to the VGO hydrotreater. So the complexity of the refineries increased, but the conversion became more flexible. It was giving more propylene, more LPG, rationalized diesel, reasonable gasoline. So this configuration became extremely popular between, let's say, 2008 to 2015, and several refineries, there are 4 or 5 refineries I can recall. uh, so the new ones all had this configuration, and the existing ones, all of them which expanded, they began to include a high severity FCC in their plant, because the intention was to maximize the production of petrochemicals. So polypropylene became a very natural, let's say, a product to be produced in the plant. The economics of these refineries improved tremendously because we are
So
converting.
they were actually complementary installations, no competitive installations in the configuration of the refineries.
No, see, whenever we set up a refinery, either it's an expansion or a grassroots, we carry out a very detailed screening study in which we look at various options. So, as part of the study itself, the model was leading us to this configuration because of the market demand, the product prices, and the conversion. See, the idea is the polypropylene we were able to sell at, let's say, 90 to 95,000 rupees a ton. VGO is like fuel oil. It's about, let's say, 35,000 rupees a ton. So the conversion is 3 times. Diesel is, let's say, 60,000 rupees a ton. So from double to triple. So the economics, the revenues start coming much faster. So most of the configuration models were directionally taking us towards a combination which suggested that it makes sense to produce to go for a high severity FCC, which can yield a lot of propylene for us, which can be utilized to convert into polypropylene. So either it was a virgin refinery like this, or in the existing refineries where we wanted to expand, let's say 6 million has to be augmented to 12 million tons. So additional 6 million ton refineries which was to come, that additional processing could be done in a manner where we could integrate the streams such that we could maximize the capacity of the high severity FCC and produce more and more propylene and consequently polypropylene from there. So typically we had lots of plants with 500 KTA polypropylene units, be it expansion or the virgin plant, and with still in the bottoms we still had cokers. So most of the refineries in India, there is a lot of coking capacity in India. It's all because of that. Maybe 40-45 million tons of coking capacity is there in India. So almost all the refineries automatically had cokers. In the middle, in the secondary processing, actually the configurations began to look a little different. It started from a combination of hydrocracker and FCC, or call it RFCC. Then it went to hydrocrackers. A lot of hydrocrackers were put up because the requirement was diesel and LPG. And then it began to look different. VGO hydrotreater and FCC. This happened on the secondary processing side. But most of the bottoms, the coker still paid off. Coker looked to be the best configuration to upgrade the vacuum residue. So most of the refineries in India look like this, including your Reliance refinery, which has the highest cooking capacity perhaps in the world. I don't think there is any installation in the world which has such high cooking capacity. And later on, what they have done is they have taken all their pet coke and put up a massive gasifier to produce a lot of syngas in the plant and integrated with their whole complex because we don't have gas in the country. So they integrated the entire refineries with gas and displaced a lot of liquids from there. And that was utilized as a feedstock to petrochemical complexes. So that is how their complexity number is extremely high. So they are the best in the world, upwards of 21. So that's only for the reason because they have got a very high complexity. So as in India, with this change of cycle and the way it went up, the configuration started changing. Uh, Most of the complexity in India, which were next to nothing till 80s or 90s, began to look at maybe seven, 7.5 types in 90s. In the era of 2000, they all started hitting around 10 or so. And between 2010 onwards, I think a number of them are in 12 to 14 regime. 12 to 14 regime. Most of the PSU refineries are in that regime. And that's the time when there was a horizontal integration, crackers are being added, lots of reforming capacities coming up, aromatic complexes are being added alongside. And then with the addition of high severity FCCs, lots of petrochemical units got into the plant. So that was the other kind of addition which happened. But broadly speaking, most of the Indian refineries look to maximize LPG. We have a rationalized diesel demand. We had capped the product of, let's say, gasoline, 20 to 25%. That's just about most of the refineries produce. The ATF, the aviation turbine fuel, also is a capped product in India, 7 to 8% of the throughput only, because irrespective of this being a growing industry, too much of ATF is not processed. In fact, we dump most of our kerosene into the diesel pool, either through straight blending or through hydroprocessing. So either in a DHDT, which is a high severity hydroprocessing unit, or in a hydrocracker, most of the surplus kerosene is upgraded as diesel. Most of the configurations in India actually look like this. Look like this. Some of the refineries, along with the high severity FCC, have also added an olefin complex. So they have chosen to utilize LPG as one feedstock, light naphtha as another. So they have rationalized the CCR throughput, either close their isomerization unit or rationalize the capacity of that so that they can have a lot of light naphtha as second feedstock. They have tried to reduce the gasoline production without changing the throughput of the refinery, have a lot of heavy naphtha also as another feedstock, and the kerosene, instead of dumping it into the hydrocracker or DHDT pool, they have utilized the light kerosene also as feedstock to an olefin complex. So there are refineries where kerosene to naphtha to LPG in a multi-feed cracker is being updated to produce as high as 1.2 to 1.7 million tons of ethylene. And along with that, depending upon how you design the cracker, we can get a lot of polypropylene also along with that. And then go for a common configuration of the downstream block to maximize your polymers, MAG, etc., etc. So these are the kind of configurations which are actually quite popular. And when we look at China also, I think they are also more or less looking at this. The only thing is their refineries are bigger. They are looking at crude to chemicals because They depending upon what crude they process, they've gone for big hydrocracking. They upgraded some of their crude to chemicals directly. So in India, I think the latest refinery which we have done is, you see, as I was telling you, up till maybe 2017 or 18, most of the refineries and petrochemical facilities have been an add-on, except perhaps a polypropylene unit close coupled to a high severity FCC. Everything else, they have come as an add-on facility. You have added an aromatic complex, added an olefin complex. But there was no refinery in India where an integrated complex would have been put up. Very recently, maybe just 2 3 days back, you must have seen a new refinery has been commissioned in India, which is a 9 million ton plant, grassroots plant, and it has a cracker and a high severity FCC as the central upgraders right from day one. So it has a very high Nelson criticality index of upwards of 17. Maybe perhaps it is number two in the world. So this is the kind of trends which are emerging for various configuration in this subcontinent. But alongside, when we look at international side, what we find is that not much of refining capacity has come. See, US, there has been nothing. Whatever they had been put up earlier on, something has been phased out. Same is the case with Europe. In fact, the refinery closures are taking place. Refining capacity is happening in Middle East. Nominally, some refinery capacity gets added. Something is getting added in Africa, and one group, as you likely are aware, is putting up a refinery. And what we found is both in Middle East as well as in let's say Africa, the considerations for the refinery configuration are vastly different from what you have in India. One part is uh, unlike Europe, where I think most of your configuration are somewhat diesel driven. Most of these refineries are actually integrated with gas, so they have a lot of liquids to upgrade. Now the choice is whether you want diesel or you want gasoline. Our experience has been that most of them prefer to produce a lot more gasoline, perhaps in the first phase, maybe later down when the requirements gets rationalized. Perhaps they might be looking at a little bit more diesel. But unlike India, where we cap gasoline, we found that the gasoline in the configurations is open. In fact, they want to maximize the gasoline. And in one refinery, we found the gasoline production can hit as high as between 45 to 55%. So their configurations look substantially different from what we are doing in India, number one. Number two, essentially they are crude producing countries, some of them. Yeah, the Middle East doesn't have a problem. They are processing their own crude. Even in Africa, a lot of crude is produced on their own. So they have a lot of their own crude to be processed. And a number of these countries are actually rich in sweet crude. So they do not have the problem of high sulfur and things like that. Now it's a conscious decision whether you want flexibility in the plant to produce a whole range of products out of a crude recipe, or you would prefer to utilize the crude which you have and see how best you can minimize your capex and maximize your production. So, in a particular refinery, we found that for a very high capacity, if the gasoline is to be maximized, they have chosen to put a very high CCR capacity. So all the naphtha is being upgraded into CCR to find way into the reformate pool. All the light naphtha and the C4 cut of LPG is upgraded in an isomerization unit, and the C4 cut is being used to upgrade in an alkylation unit. And the crude is such where most of the refineries don't require a vacuum column. So most of the resid or the reduced crude oil which comes from the atmospheric column bottoms, they are directly upgrading into an RFCC. So the overall complexity of the refinery is low, but the produce is extremely high. So if gasoline is the intent, entire RCO can go into an FCC, which you can design on the diesel on the gasoline max route, rationalize maybe your diesel production from there, not go for very high severity, maybe 540 to 550 at best, and maximize your gasoline content. So these refineries, for all the naphtha which they have, they put a prime G kind of a unit, IFP kind of process, which is now there. And the LCO, which is produced from the refineries, can be upgraded into a DHDT, where possibly they have changed the severity levels to vary between, let's say, 18% to 35%, so that they can maximize the gasoline. So, unlike India, where the intention is to produce more diesel, more LPG, they have requirements of practically negligible LPG requirements, maybe reasonable diesel of 20 to 25%, but they want to uh, maximize the gasoline content. And from the FCC, because if the refinery is very large, the throughput to the RFCC being very high, correspondingly, the propylene which is produced from there, even at low severity levels, are good enough to support very high polypropylene capacity. So most of these refineries are equipped with, let's say, a crude distillation unit, a mild hydrocracker, an RFCC, and RFCC close coupled to a propylene recovery unit, and which is in turn coupled to a polypropylene block. And all the naphtha is actually upgraded either into isomerate for the light naphtha, and the heavy naphtha is reformed to get into the CCR unit, and from the FCC all C4 cuts and the straight run material that is upgraded in your alkylation block. So obviously with alkylation, with isomerization, and with CCR, oh, a lot of naphtha gets upgraded into gasoline. So the gasoline make is very high, upwards of 45%, and diesel is actually rationalized. But the flexibility is there in the plant through the mild hydrocracker unit, so that you can swing most of the material between gasoline and diesel. This is another popular configuration. In the Middle East, what we have generally found is that they, they, they also have complex configurations, but it's both ways. You know, we have seen we have seen a combination there, somewhat like India, where they are looking at a hydrocracker, FCC. They are also looking at petrochemical makes. Lots of them are looking at high severity FCCs. We found there is a lot of PDH capacity which they have created in their refineries, which I think some of the refiners are now looking at. They convert all the residual propane. If they don't have an LPG requirement, they are converting most of their propane into PDH. In India, on the contrary, PDH plants are coming up, but for that, either it is imported propane, or the propane fraction which is to be recovered from, let's say, LNG, which we are procuring. Because LPG, which is produced in the refineries, we really cannot utilize the propane cut from there because we want to maximize the LPG. So this is the way I thought most of the configurations are actually beginning to take shape. Just a brief comparative assessment. In terms of India, I think most of the technologies which have been used, uh, crude vacuum distillation unit, are all open art. So in India, as I mentioned yesterday, EIL is a pioneer consultancy organization which does the process design for all the open art facilities. And most of the secondary processing units, be it a hydrocracker has come from UOP. We have one or two installations from Chevron also. FCC, high severity FCCs in India mostly have been supplied by Stone Webster, now Technip. Most of high severity FCC have come from there. But in the early days, the ones which were, let's say, fuel oil driven, or fuel maximization demand. We have both Exxon and also UOP, lots of FCCs. CCRs, I think it's between Accents and UOP. Most of them are equally shared. Hydrogen plants, I think the technologies of the plants are equally shared between KTI and Haldor. So there is a certain preference by, or let's say an emerging preference by one block we see it's mostly Haldor for the hydrogen generation. But there are a number of KTI plants also in India, KTI Techno plants. So that's how hydrogen. Most of the cokers in India, barring Reliance, have come from ABB Lamas. In fact, in the PSU segment, it is all ABB Lamas. There is no Foster Wheeler, but Reliance is Foster Wheeler. So that's how the coking has come up. Polypropylene, we have a combination, which is varying from INEOS to Basel to Novoline. All licenses are there almost. So they have supplied various kinds of processes. DHDT and DHDS units, it's been a combination. Either it is Accents or UOP, either of them have supplied these. Incidentally, India also has now a technology of its own on this. Isomerization, okay, partly UOP, in fact, maximum UOP, but some of the units have come from our friends also. On the aromatic complexes, all the complexes where you have put a paraxylene unit, mostly it is UOP. So all the entire aromatic block has come from UOP, and the PTA complexes have been supplied mostly by DuPont at a certain point of time. But now I think maybe the recent plants, maybe they have changed or they've gone to a different licensor. In the early days, it was mostly DuPont. The olefin plants seem to have a distinct trend in India. All the liquid crackers with multi feed, they are predominantly ABB Lamas. One plant is by Linde, and but largely they are ABB Lamas. But there are some neat gas crackers also in the country, which are sitting on the associated gas, which is coming from Mumbai High, and those plants actually are supported by Stone Webster technology, which is now Technip, of course. So you have a few crackers, gas crackers, where predominantly it is Stone Webster, now Technip, and liquid crackers mostly we have seen ABB Lamas to support all these things. On the polymers, I think for the polypropylene unit, as I told you, it's been a multiplicity of all these licenses: Basel, Ineos, Novoline. HDP needs slurry process. It's either come from Mitsui or from Philips. 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 What is that? Philips Chem. So they have supplied plants. I mean, they are the best technology in the world, and lots of swing units. They have been supplied by one or two plants have come from INEOS, but largely it is Univation. Univation is supplied. One or two plants have come from Grace also. The capacity is very large now. Wherever it is very large, I think it's going. They've got a Grace also. But I think largely we have Univation plants for the swing technology. So that's the way most of the technology makeup is there. MEG units mostly have come from scientific design. There are one or two units by Shell also, but predominantly it's been scientific design. Uh, VCM, PVC, the earlier plants were all by Goodrich. I haven't seen a new plant coming up, so I really can't say on that. So that's the way. This is the kind of technology makeup which is there. So in India, as I was mentioning yesterday, most of the technology grouping and setting it together to play the role of a managing licensor actually is carried out by EIL. But some of the private companies basket all their technologies. So just like Reliance went to UOP, and basketed all the technologies. Similarly, we've seen refineries in Kuwait, Middle East, also in Africa, where people have basketed technologies and they have gone through a managing licensor route, just like Petrobras. So they have gone to these fellows, and mostly it's been a UOP. In a few cases, it's been Technip actions, but I think we still see a predominance of UOP as a managing licensor to support all the technologies because they are able to probably offer 70 to 80% of their technologies, and for the others, the owners can support, and the main licensor can integrate. That is how I think most of these configurations have been evolved. So I think, unless of course you have some questions, I can address those.
Mm. Is there no penetration of Chinese technology in India? Because the Chinese, they have been developing heavily
Which
technologies.
resid?
Everything. DCC
Resid
is
hydrocracking.
one, but they have been developing aromatics block and hydro
Yeah,
treatment, hydrocracking. They are in all segments of the technologies that go
yeah, yeah.
into a refinery in the world.
One major development which is taking place now in India is to introduce resid hydrocracking. So most of the cokers
Mhm.
are either being rationalized or resid hydrocracking is being added in the refineries because now more or less cokers are capped in the country. So there are certain refineries which are completely putting slurry hydrocracking at the bottoms, or they are putting a combination of delayed coker and slurry hydrocracking. Now, slurry hydrocracking could be in various routes. It could be evaluated bed, it could be Emax, which ABB is offering, which is a preferred technology in India. Because the intention over here is to produce as much distillate recovery as is possible. And in this slurry hydrocracking process, we are able to get up to 92% recovery. So recently, a very big resin hydrocracker has been put in India on the Emax route, where very large capacity has been supported, upwards of 3 million tons for the resin hydrocracker. It's an expensive plant, all right, but that's the way it is. And in some of the expansions now, resin hydrocracker is being included in the configuration. So it enhances the base, gives you a VGO cut, for which either you can put a hydrocracker or you can route it to your high severity FCC. You are calling it DCC, one of those, so that you can get a lot of petrochemicals from there. So that's another important development which is happening. So far in India, I think they've chosen both either ABB Lamas has supplied that Emax technology, and of course UOP, Accents, all these fellows have been in the fray. But KBR has not been successful in India so far. They have competed hard, but so far they haven't won a license. Mostly it is ABB. But KBR has been struggling to get their first license, at least in the refining segment. They are strong on the fertilizer side, but on the refining slurry hydrocracking, we found Emax is supporting Indian configurations well. You asked about Chinese, is it? You asked
Yes,
question about the Chinese. The
yes,
Chinese
exactly.
technology are not there in India.
And
Huh?
so you mean they are absolutely not present in India, the Chinese
No.
technology
Actually,
providers?
I don't want to use the word moratorium, but somehow or the other, on the front end side, there is not much of an engagement with China to source technology from them. If at all, there is only interest in some maybe coal gasification linked technologies on which they are strong. So perhaps there could be some case which some private sector company might pick up, but public sector companies perhaps are not looking at it. So most of the gasification, as is being conceived, they are looking at Shell, GE, those kind of processes, or maybe even Linde. Now probably Air Products, I think. So they are the kind of players who are in active in this domain. So that's it. There is a lot of gasification study which has also been done in the refineries to see how best we can. But in India, what has happened is CFBC is a preferred technology. So most of the coke, pet coke, which is being produced, at least in the new configurations, it is being examined. This pet coke can go into CFBC boilers to produce steam and power, and that's a emerging technology. We find that is cheaper, much cheaper than gasification. So pet coke actually, if at all, will blend with the coal, and then they will support coal to chemicals. That kind of integration might happen. Currently, most of the coke is finding way into cement kilns. Mostly, that's the way it is. So this is the perspective of what's happening. Any other question which you have?
So possibly a subject for another session, or very much likely. Where do you see you talked about, or you mentioned integration, petrochemicals integration? Where do you see the major projects? So obviously with Reliance, we're seeing activities and expansions on that, and Haldia. Do you see some trends really emerging where petrochemicals will be happening in the Indian market, and who will be driving that?
See, actually, as we understand, Reliance is possibly not looking to go into higher petrochemicals now. There was a certain point in time where they were engaging themselves with Saudi Aramco, and they were looking into a petrochemical installation to be set up. But that project has not taken off. In between, I think they have changed their priorities a little bit. That's what the market news is. So they are looking more at communications, retail, green hydrogen, that kind of an integration. And I think on the energy segment, both on the refineries and petrochemical side, probably they do not have immediate plans. On the contrary, in the public sector, there are a lot of projects which are happening. In fact, there are rather three large petrochemicals which are already underway. One is happening in Bina, along with that's a BPCL refinery. So that is one. There are two petrochemical complexes which are happening in Paradip. So there is an aromatic complex as well as an olefin complex, which is happening in Paradip. In Haldia, there was a talk of the cracker expansion because the current plant is a very old and a vintage one, but they have a lot of feedstock related issues because currently their feedstock, which is naphtha, comes from an IOCL refinery. So there is one interface there, and to overcome an issue of, let's say, outages of supplies, they import a lot of naphtha. So their plant is actually subject to a little bit of vagaries of feedstock availability. So they haven't really been looking at the capacity to be expanded. They've been talking about it. At one point of time, they were looking at a virgin refinery to maximize naphtha production over there and look for more petrochemicals to be produced by another cracker. That unfortunately didn't happen. On the contrary, what they were looking, the Purlendu group was looking down south to create a big petrochemical facility. They were looking at two olefin plants to be created based on imported naphtha. I think probably they had an arrangement with either Japan or Korea to get the naphtha from there and convert it into higher petrochemicals, both in terms of polymers, etc., etc. But I'm not quite sure what is the progress of all these plants. They did do the feed part of it, but I'm not quite sure whether they've taken up for implementation. On the contrary, most of the PSU refineries are somehow getting gas integrated as more and more gas is being available. So they are actively looking at petrochemicals, either to add an aromatic complex or to add an olefin complex depending upon the market requirements. So I think
So when you talk about PSU, it's a public sector undertaking. These are refineries where the government is the shareholder.
major shareholder, 51% and above is by government, balance is by public and institutions.
Which refineries are that essentially, these PSUs?
Almost all the refineries in India except Reliance and SR. Reliance, SR, and Haldia, these three are in the private sector, and you can say HMEL also, Guru Gobind Singh Refinery, which is an arrangement between Mittal Group and HPCL. It's a JV kind of an arrangement. But for these, everything is a public sector undertaking. So in India, actually, the hydrocarbon sector is predominantly public sector driven, where essentially the objective function is that whatever products are produced, they should specifically cater to the domestic public at large. So gasoline, diesel, LPG has to preferentially find way into the domestic market, and surplus, if any, only can be exported. So to that extent, the government does exercise some indirect control. Although the refineries are all big and they are Maharatna boards, so they have a lot of flexibility to take their own decisions. But ultimately, there is a social aspect linked with it, so government has a role to play in that. The private sector companies, on the contrary, are independent. So whatever they produce, in fact, the Reliance refineries, one of them is an export-oriented refinery. So whatever they produce, so they are actually exporting all the products. The other
This is
refinery,
the J2
sorry, yeah, yeah,
JRP
yeah,
here, the
that's right.
Jamnagar Export
But
Refinery of Reliance.
correct. But the basic or the base refinery, there is a lot of product takeoff which takes place between Reliance and the public sector companies. So instead of they being allowed to distribute the products or go to the pump, actually it is the public sector undertaking through an arrangement purchase all the products from them and distribute it in the country. So the distribution part predominantly is with the public sector. Only Naira refinery is an exception where they have their own petrol pumps. I think they have put some pumps and they are selling product at the pump also. So that's the way it is. So as we were discussing the other day, most of the refineries in India being in the public sector undertaking, actually when they enter into arrangements, it's more on the crude crude side of arrangements which they can enter into. But actually they don't prefer themselves to get locked to a particular source. Because Indian refineries, as I told you, are so designed that we want to be flexible from the source of supply, so that we can process anything in the refinery. So that's the kind of thing which happens. But there were some new refineries which were configured, wherein there was an arrangement to be discussed with, let's say, ADNOC and Saudi Aramco, along with Indian PSUs to set up some refineries. But somehow or the other, those projects have not taken off. And even in the early days, I think some kind of arrangement has been explored. But we haven't seen any FDI flowing in India on these projects. We really haven't seen much. Much means actually I haven't seen nothing, anything. So it's mostly set up by PSUs or exclusively by private sector companies.
It would call out to me for international joint ventures. We talked already about this one, but um, there's a lot of potential, of course, in the Indian market, and still a heavy focus on gasoline, diesel, and export refineries in this, and to really make it a game changer in a way. It You would expect that someone would call in to set up an international joint venture. So there's still one Saudi Aramco project is seems to be going forward, but we're not hearing of many other projects were just to invite a petrochemicals player to say we're making a joint venture on the olefins and polyolefins side, of course, as much downstream as possible to look for further diversification.
See, only problem with those kind of arrangements is as long as somebody is interested in setting up a project with the confirmed takeoff the way the government wants, then it is fine. But if the players want a market share, then I think it becomes a little complex. That is how, at least we have seen in India, not many of these arrangements are taking off, as is very common elsewhere in the West. So I think there possibly there is a lot of flexibility in terms of marketing the product also. In India, to our mind, both in refineries and petrochemicals, we found that that flexibility is perhaps missing a little bit. Refineries certainly it is non-existent, but even in petrochemicals, we haven't seen a big major coming to invest here in India. Although, as you very rightly say, India is now heading to become a petrochemical hub also. So we there is likelihood of so many crackers coming up, so much of polymer capacity to be created. New grassroots refineries still are being conceived, are being set up. See, currently we are at about 270 million tons capacity. By in the next couple of years, we might add another 40 million tons. So we might go up to 310, 320. And then I think there are plans to take it up to 400 million tons. So that means there will be a continuous addition of refineries. The orientation may begin to look more like petrochemicals. So we might produce 26 to maybe even 35% of petrochemicals. And we put a combination of aromatic plus olefin complexes, it might be upward of 40% because gasoline and diesel requirements are rationalizing to a large extent. And whatever will be required will be additionally to support the growth of the economy. So that will happen. But I haven't still found any foreign major to come and invest in India. So there are two problems which we see in that. One is uh, one is that India is not a very simple country to work at. This is what we have realized because on the commercial part, if there is a public sector undertaking which is get involved, then it is a taxpayers' money. So there is too much of vigilante and checks by the government audits. So that is one problem with private sector companies foresee they feel that their freedom to operate is restricted. And second part is if they come here to set up projects like EPC players and things like that, they find that the payment terms and flexibility to operate is not as much. Our contracts are very rigid because we do not believe in contracts to entertain any extra claims on the contract. So there is a lot of upfront work which is done. So whatever is stipulated in the feed, that has to be followed. So there are no mid-course changes which takes place and things like that. And the conventional value addition, which seems to be the general norm elsewhere in the world, it is very difficult in India because we've seen all these big players, Toyo, Technimont, uh, Samsung, all these players, Dialem, all these fellows working in India and finding it extremely difficult because here the contracting arrangements are very rigid. We do not follow FIDIC here by way of contracts. We have our own system of contracting, and they find it extremely difficult to handle that kind of stuff. So that is why we have seen foreign participation in the hydrocarbon segment is very nominal. For the first time, we are seeing a major investment coming in the offshore segment because India made a major policy tweak in their offshore production sharing arrangements. So that is why, for the first time, we are seeing Chevron, Exxon, BP, all these big players supporting the locals, ONGC, OIL, and others for exploration projects, deep sea exploration, and things like that. So that is the first time where I am finding that these fellows are coming actually. to do something here in India, and I think they have found a commercial arrangement a little bit more flexible and to their satisfaction. But on the downstream side, where India itself possesses a lot of skills, uh, it is just a question of bringing in money. That why anybody
Yes.
will do that. So if they bring in money, then they would like the product take-off flexibility, the way they want to control the prices and all that. That is not possible in India. So there is,
So I think these are very interesting topics.
but but
We will
but
be addressing in follow-up discussions. So project
yeah,
finance and bankability of project
yeah,
is one, mode of project management, EPC and so on. We will be discussing also separately about these. I think this will be very exciting conversations we'll have.
yeah. The next session we can have on how projects are built in India, which is different from the way which is built elsewhere.
Excellent.
That I think should be very interesting.
Exactly.
And there, most of these questions, queries as to how others do not come here, what is so peculiar about this country, that I think will be very interesting. We can have a next session on that. There's no problem.
Okay. Do you have more questions to Sanjay over, or we can close
No,
this
that's fine.
session
Thank
now?
you very much, Sanjay.
So, thank you very much, Sanjay. This has been a great conversation again, a great overview about the refining industry, both in India and elsewhere, like Africa. This has been Molecules to Market, and we invite listeners and viewers to hit the like button, to subscribe to our channels, to share this episode, and to comment. And we see you next time on our following episodes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure being with you.